Is about lab equipment and usage that we use in our sixth grade lab. This covers learning targets 3 and 4, which are about lab equipment names and proper usage of lab equipment. The first piece of lab equipment I would like to introduce to you is the graduated cylinder. This piece of equipment's job is to measure volume of liquids. It does an excellent job of doing this. It's designed to be very accurate. If you notice, on the sides of the graduated cylinder there are lines, and then there's a scale and numbers. Later on we'll be teaching you how to read a graduated cylinder, but these pieces of equipment are very accurate at measuring volume of a liquid. Now later on we're going to see some equipment that also has lines and measurement lines, but they're not as accurate as the graduated cylinder. So in lab, the only thing we're going to have you use to measure measured liquids is the graduated cylinder. The next piece of equipment is called the Florence flask. It is designed for uniform heating and ease of swirling. You'll notice that it has this unique round shape at the bottom. That does two things. First, if you're going to heat a liquid, you can heat it from the bottom. You imagine like a candle or what we call a Bunsen burner, which has got a flame, and you can imagine this sitting over on top of that flame. Well, with this piece of equipment, the liquid's going to get hot at the bottom near the heat source, and then it's going to travel up, and then the cool liquid that's at the top is going to come down. And so what ends up happening is the liquid gets heated at a constant temperature from both top and bottom. Now, that doesn't necessarily happen with all pieces of equipment. Imagine later on we're going to look at a beaker. It looks like a cup. It doesn't have that nice round shape. Well, what ends up happening is the liquid at the bottom gets hotter than the liquid at the top, and so it does not have that unique uniform heating. Also, with that round bulbous shape, you can grab the neck of the Florence flask, that long top part, and you can swirl it around. And if you have two liquids together and you want to mix them, you can swirl them around this way, and the liquid's going to stay in the flask. Now, if you try to do that with a cup or something, that kind of shape, you can imagine you swirl around, the liquid's going to fall all over the place. It's going to fall on your shoes and clothes and make a big old mess. So that's the Florence flask. The next one I just got done talking about is the beaker. It's used for holding liquid mainly, but we can use it for all sorts of different things. You can hold also solids and things like that in there. Now, as I was saying earlier, you'll notice that on the beaker it also has measurement lines, but these are not as accurate as a graduated cylinder. They're just kind of approximate. It even tells you on the side that approximately 5% error there, and what that means is that there's a chance it's 5% off on the volume if you use that as your tool to measure volume. So it's not exactly accurate. So we don't want you to use a beaker to measure volume. Again, that's what the graduated cylinder is for. This is just to kind of hold chemicals and things like that and transfer things. The next flask we have is the Erlenmeyer flask, and again, as you look at it, it's got a unique shape. It's got that triangular shape. This allows, like the Florence flask, to mix chemicals. You can grab the Erlenmeyer flask and swirl it around, and the chemicals should stay in the flask itself. Now, unlike the Florence flask, though, you're not going to get that uniform heating, but you can again mix chemicals together. Watch glass. This looks like a gigantic contact lens. We can use this if we have a chemical that has something in it, like for example salt water, where we got two chemicals kind of combined, and we want to remove the water. So what we can do is we can heat the watch glass, and the water will evaporate, and for example salt water, the salt will kind of stay in the glass. Though as the water evaporates, the salt will kind of dissipate out and then stay in the glass, and so we can separate salt from the water. It's also good if you want to weigh some solids, especially if they're in powder form or small. You can put them on the watch glass, and then it's easier to weigh them and then try to keep track of them. They can also be used as cover for beakers. The Petri dish is used to mainly culture cells. It's a small, like it looks like a dish, really. It's not very thick, and ours are plastic. And which we can do is they're great for growing bacteria or growing cells. You can pour like this. It looks like gelatin, but it's an agar, which is it's like a food for cells, and you can put that at the bottom of these petri dishes, and then since they're clear, they'll let light in and things like that. But a lot of our petri dishes also have a cover. So if you're going to grow something that smells like bacteria, then you can also cover them so the light comes through, but yet the smell doesn't come out. So that's what we use petri dishes mainly for. Everybody's probably familiar with the test tubes. Our test tubes are glass, so you've got to be careful handling them. But test tubes are used for holding chemicals. Pretty simple devices. Along with test tubes, though, you need to use a test tube rack. These are wooden racks that have holes in them, the size for test tubes, and this basically holds the test tubes in place. As you probably can tell, test tubes have a round bottom, so you can't like stand one on the side by itself. You got to use a test tube rack to kind of hold it. So that's what the test tube rack does. It just kind of holds the test tubes while you're doing your experiment. The next thing is a rubber stopper. Obviously made from rubber, hence the name rubber stopper, and it prevents chemicals from coming out. And there's also different sizes of rubber stoppers. We have some stoppers that plug up Erlenmeyer flasks and Florence flasks. We have small rubber stoppers that plug up test tubes. Some rubber stoppers have a hole in them, and you may be like, well, why does it have a hole in it? That's so that you could put a tube in there, like a straw or a plastic tube, and allow gases to escape while chemicals are reacting with each other. We have stoppers that do have holes, and we have stoppers that don't have holes, depending on our need. The next one is a test tube holder. Now this device is used to hold test tubes while they're being heated. Test tubes being made of glass, if you're going to heat a chemical in a test tube, the glass is going to get extremely hot. So you never want to hold a test tube while it's being heated. This device allows you to kind of hold on to that test tube without burning your fingers. You just squeeze the sides, the clasp opens, you put the test tube in, let go of the sides, and it kind of holds on to the test tube for you. The next thing is a test tube brush. This is obviously used to clean the test tubes out. Just be careful with this. I've seen more injuries with a test tube brush than anything else. Students get excited, they're cleaning their test tubes, and it gets all soapy in there, and you put the brush in, and you move the brush up and down, the soap goes all over the place and makes a lot of bubbles. It's kind of cool, but just be careful, because if you jam these things into the test tube too hard, the bottoms of the test tube will break off, and then of course you have a danger of cutting yourself, because the bottom of the test tube again becomes very sharp, and depending on how you're holding it, you could jam the test tube into your hand, which obviously would not tickle and not be a pleasant experience. So just kind of be careful when you're using a test tube brush not to hit the bottom of the test tube too hard. Here's another type of stopper we use. This is called a cork stopper. You may be wondering why we have two stoppers. Well, some chemicals react with rubber, and if they do, then you're going to want to use a cork. And then, of course, some chemicals react with cork. Cork stoppers are, again, they're the same thing as rubber stoppers. They can stop up the Erlenmeyer flask or Florence flask or test tube. It's, just depending on the size of the cork. Eyedropper, everybody's probably used one of these. It's just allows you to move small amounts of liquid and place the small amounts of liquid where you need it. Spatula. Anybody's been around a kitchen kind of knows what a spatula is. Now, the spatulas in a science lab and the spatulas in the kitchen are a little bit different in the fact that in the science lab, they're made of metal and they have flat ends on each side. The flat ends are what we can use to transfer small amounts of powder or solid or some people use them in dissection to move organs of whatever they're dissecting things. So it's just, they're kind of a useful tool that can be used in a variety of different ways. We can also use them to spread, the substance out on a glass slide. So they got a variety of different uses. Stirring rods. Be careful. Again, our stirring rods are made of glass. They fall, they break, and then they have a sharp end to them. So you just kind of be careful. If you break one, just let me know. But just kind of be careful. Now, stirring rods, their job is to mix chemicals. You're probably going to, well, why does it have to be glass? Why don't we just use straws or something like that? Well, not too many chemicals out there react with glass. So that's why we use glass stirring rods. Where, if you're using a plastic straw, if a solution's hot, it'll melt the plastic, or it can react with the plastic and melt the plastic. Certain chemicals are corrosive in that way. Well, they won't react with the glass, so that's why we use glass stirring rods. The next tool we commonly use is called the forceps, also known as tweezers, but in science we call them the forceps. And they're used for grasping and manipulating and extracting items out, small things, or stuff like we really can't use our fingers to grasp very easily. The next tool is called the scalpel. It's basically a knife. We use it to cut things. Just again, obviously common sense tells you need to be careful because there's a sharp end to that, or sharp blade. But we use that for cutting. Thermometer, obviously used to measure temperature. Our thermometers are glass and alcohol based, so if one breaks, it's okay. It's not like there's also the mercury kind of thermometers. You don't find those too much anymore. Ours are alcohol based, and they're perfectly safe. But again, we use this to measure temperatures. Last thing is the funnel. This is used to transfer liquid. Especially if a liquid has a small opening in the container, we'll use a funnel to make sure that the liquid doesn't spill all over the place. Like for example, test tubes. The mouth of a test tube is not very big, and if you're going to pour, from a bottle, trying to get into that test tube is kind of a small target to hit. And so we could use a funnel to do that, to kind of make a bigger target, and then getting a liquid down into the test tube, or some other device or container that has a small mouth.